Good afternoon, all. My name is Matthew Zammit-Maempel, and I'm joined today by my teammates, Shirley Zhang, Michelle Kellam, and Sumaiya Kabir Talukder. We are graduate students at the Maxwell School of Public Policy at McGill University. The Department of Natural Resources Canada, NRCan, presented us with a policy problem. In what ways can Natural Resources Canada and other federal departments help spur Canada's transition to a circular economy? The scope of this project includes looking particularly at the resource extraction and processing activities across three sectors: forestry, energy, and mining. Our task was to provide a Canada-specific approach to the circular economy and explain why it is necessary. We also identified 5 policy recommendations to help Canada's transition to a circular economy. Shirley will start by giving us some context on what the circular economy is about.
Thank you, Matthew. So, there are many different definitions of a circular economy, as if it were an ideal future that is truly sustainable, zero waste, and symbiotic with the resources we have. Traditionally speaking, people have adopted a linear production consumption model. People's lifestyles constantly consume limited resources to create products that are later directly discarded. The linear economy does reuse a small fraction of the materials. However, linear economy model has been viewed as unsustainable. It is especially true as the global population and standard of living rises. The circular economy presents an innovative and more sustainable model of how material can be extracted and consumed, how residual waste and pollution can be managed. In particular, this means a better understanding of global supply chains and making supply chain visible from end to end. Most existing circular economy models originate in non-resource-based economies and focus on managing impacts on the consumer side. We propose a Canadian approach for the circular economy to better reflect its place in the global value chain. Our approach recognizes 2 key requirements and a key consideration to bring circularity to Canada's natural resource sector. The first key requirement is resource and energy efficiency. Since Canadian economy sits at the extraction and processing stages of production in the sectors of forestry, energy, and mining, it will use the smallest necessary quantity of inputs in order to extract and process natural resources. Making use of both physical resources and a competitive, highly skilled workforce has been a winning combination and could be a major element in Canada's transition to a more circular economy. The second key requirement is to maximize value while minimizing residuals. It seeks opportunities to create value within the economy for its residual materials and energy. Maximizing value must be done at all levels, including the international scale. Domestically, maximizing value includes cost saving and designing products to extend their life cycle. Minimizing residuals also include finding new and better uses for unused material and byproducts, and reducing the volume for non-reusable outputs. A key consideration should be kept in mind at all times is to include Indigenous participation throughout Canada's transition to a circular economy, as it is an ongoing and long-term project. Strong partnerships with Indigenous peoples are needed at all steps of the transition. Canada could be a leader among resource-based economies. Its work on low-carbon economy and sustainable development are good starting points. But there is still much more work ahead to make Canada's transition to a circular economy. Now, my colleague Michelle will talk about the obstacles that Canada may face with respect to a Canadian circular economy.
Thanks, Shirley. So why isn't the Canadian natural resource economy circular now? Each of the 3 sectors are at different stages of circularity, but across all 3 of them, we see some similar obstacles. And understanding these obstacles has helped us identify relevant policy options. The first obstacle relates to short-term costs and long-term signals. Many countries have moved towards circularity in response to scarcity or cost of resources, but this has not been Canada's case. Here, primary resources like new plastics are often less expensive and more accessible than secondary ones like recycled plastics. And this reflects a broader challenge. In the short term, many of the changes needed to improve circularity do cost more. Installing a renewable energy system or reconfiguring a pulp mill to make biofilm both carry high upfront costs. Not many firms will make these kind of changes without clear signals from the demand side or from policymakers. In addition, circularity implies taking account of residual or waste materials and energy. But many of these are still treated as externalities. Making firms accountable for these costs will motivate them to seek value and minimize waste, but it will also increase their costs in the short term. The second obstacle is technological and scientific gaps. For example, leftover materials from historical mining operations still contain billions of dollars of gold and other valuable minerals. Even the rock itself may have value as a construction material. However, the particle size of the metals tends to be relatively small to the overall volume of waste, and harmful elements like mercury are sometimes present. Conventional mining techniques often can't separate the metal, rock, and toxic elements at these concentrations. Other gaps are specific to Canada's climate and geography. On long summer days, solar panels have the potential to meet many energy needs of small communities. However, throughout the winter, many of these same solar panel systems do not produce meaningful amounts of energy. Without a long-term energy storage mechanism, solar energy is not likely to play the same role in Canada as it is playing elsewhere. Overcoming these technological barriers is expensive. The cost of research and development often exceeds the benefits that an individual firm or individual community might gain. The third obstacle relates to regulation and liability. Regulation is important. Regulations protect workers' safety, public health, the environment, and other important values. But regulations designed with these other objectives in mind may inadvertently get in the way of change. And just to give you an example, in Ontario provides a list of regulatory requirements that might apply to mining operations within the province, and that list is 93 pages long. In addition to that, natural resources, the economy, and the environment are all areas of shared and overlapping jurisdiction in Canada, so there isn't a single regulating jurisdiction. Trying to respect these regulations is especially hard with new products and new methods that weren't anticipated in the existing regulatory framework. The last obstacle I'll discuss are information and knowledge gaps. Finding new and better uses for materials and energy requires communication with manufacturers, consumers, and other processors. But because some of this information is commercially sensitive, and because some manufacturers and consumers don't yet see the need to change, this direct engagement isn't happening, or not at the rate we'd like it to. This lack of communication is discouraging processors from adopting new technologies and materials. For policymakers, key information about circularity and efficiency is not easily accessible. For example, flows of many non-toxic residuals are not tracked, and there's just no comprehensive measure or reporting of how scrap materials are already recovered, recycled, and reused beneficially in Canada. Without this quantitative information, it will remain difficult for decision makers to identify targeted policies or compare possible policy options. I'll now pass you back to Shirley, who will talk about our methodology.
Thank you, Michelle. For the overall methodology, our study used qualitative approaches, including literature review, data collection, and key informant interviews. We reviewed previous circular economy studies and collected relevant information from secondary sources. To assess and evaluate our 28 proposed policy options, we produced a set of criteria and measures. We divided the overall circular economy objectives into two sections, our primary objective and the secondary objectives. The primary objective is effective circularity. So we developed the Our Circular Economy Evaluation Tool, as you can see on the slide. It was designed to evaluate circularity of different policy proposals for the resource-based economies like Canada. The Our Evaluation Tool is built off two pre-existing frameworks, 9R and Resolve. In our evaluation model, 3 levels of circularity, high, medium, and low, have been distinguished. For being high circularity, the policy option would set out a clear, concrete plan for contributing to circularity, and was evidence supporting the claim that the plan can meet the criteria for optimize or upgrade. For being medium circularity, the policy option would have a strategy that is clear on how it contributes to the circular economy, or it would meet the criteria for revitalize or resuscitate. For being low circularity, the policy option would have a strategy that is unclear on how it contributes to the circular economy, or it would meet the criteria for reprocess or recover. In addition to the primary objectives of the circularity, we consider 6 secondary objectives. These 6 secondary objectives address the practicality of selected options. For each objective, we assign each policy option a score of high, medium, or low, which follows the convention that higher return values are better than lower return values. The first is on cost effectiveness. Cost effectiveness is the extent to which an option has achieved or is expected to achieve its results at the lowest possible cost. The second is on administrative feasibility. It measures the complexity of the planning and implementation of the option, timeliness of implementation, and administrative burdens on government. The third is on technical feasibility. It measures the options based on the availability, scale, and stage of technology. The fourth is on equity. This category evaluates whether options may help to achieve long-term social equity by equitably distributing costs and benefits, including on industry, non-industry stakeholders, and to future generations. The fifth is on competitiveness. It is important to determine the extent to which option boosts economic opportunities or market competitiveness for Canadian firms, both at home and on the international stage. Lastly, the sixth one is on measurability. Measurability is essential in order to evaluate whether an implemented option is meeting its objectives. Though implementation is out of the scope of this current project, it is important to assess whether there was reasonable potential for measurement at the stage of selecting options. Our recommendations are based on these systematic comparisons of each option's contribution to the overall circular economy objectives. Now my colleagues Matthew, Sumaiya, and Michelle will present you our 5 policy recommendations.
Recommendation number 1, provide financial and research support to remine and decontaminate orphaned and abandoned mines. Air, water, and ground contamination from orphaned mine sites across Canada presents risks to both the ecosystems around them and to the communities that live nearby. This policy recommendation will have the federal government support mining companies to remine and at the same time decontaminate residual materials from orphaned and abandoned mines. By doing this, the long-term liability for contaminated areas is reduced and the environment around it can be rehabilitated. This supports other ongoing federal initiatives to address contamination on Crown land. The mining industry will also benefit from the economic advantages of getting access to billions of dollars of residuals that are currently found in tailings ponds and sites across Canada. These residuals can then be used in products without having to mine new sites. This proposed pilot project would run from 5 to 10 years, with NRCan providing research and development to support and prove the potential of existing remining technologies to industry. This research support will help lower the cost of future investment in this technology for industry. NRCan is already working on this with efforts like their Mining Value from Waste initiative. This is likely the highest cost recommendation out of our 5 recommendations. There are still some risks here, with no assurance that firms will actually start using this remining technology unless it is tested and proven to be effective. There is also much work to be done to show the value of remining is comparable to the costs of new mining operations. That is not the case right now. Although costly, this pilot program or pilot project is addressing two market failures. The first, it addresses the high risk of disturbing tailings that have been left behind from past operations. It does this by remining using today's heightened mining standards and by developing and using new techniques to handle residuals. It addresses the insufficient research and development from firms because the research support will help establish common knowledge for firms on remining and make the technology more accessible. So that's the second market failure it helps to address. This recommendation has enormous potential to improve circularity. It can contribute to the optimized category you'll see in our circular evaluation tool by increasing the efficiency of how future mining operations are done. It also contributes to the upgrade category in our evaluation tool by restoring and retaining the health of ecosystems. On to recommendation number 2. Adjust and extend the Sustainable Development Technology Fund. Innovative technology needs help in bridging the gap that exists between when an idea is first conceived to when it ultimately reaches the commercialization stage. Several funds exist to help projects that are at various technology readiness levels. Sustainable Development Technology Fund is run by the Department of Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, ISED, for supporting clean tech projects. This recommendation will have NRCan support the continuation of this fund. It also includes adjusting the current environmental performance criteria for project eligibility so that it reflects circular principles. One of the fund's current requirements is that the environmental performance of new technology is better than that of existing technologies. This is a low bar. The criteria should be changed to a circular requirement. We suggest this new criteria be: how will the proposed technology reduce waste generation? Or how will the proposed technology repurpose previously unused residuals? This will help focus Canada's spending on projects that will increase circularity. By requiring all sustainable development projects under this fund to show an element of circularity, Canada will send clear, predictable signals about government priorities so that researchers and industries can adjust and plan accordingly. This recommendation is not without faults. Many projects that receive money under this fund will not make it to the commercialization stage. Also, by adjusting the criteria to be more circular, this may exclude other good projects from coming forward under this fund. Also, the potential impacts of these projects on circularity may be difficult to measure because of the wide range of different technologies that can succeed under this program. What this recommendation does do, though, is refine the environmental criteria to be more specific. Projects that succeed under this fund can be the technology needed for our future shift to renewable energy and materials. It can help clean energy projects reach commercialization while prioritizing ones that support a long-term reduction of waste and make use of residuals. This policy also supports a future of competitive Canadian firms by helping them to create products for Canadians and for export to other markets. It would also support retention of intellectual property and of employment opportunities within Canada. Continuing long-term funding programs like this send positive signals to Canadian firms. Sumaiya will now be explaining recommendations number 3 and recommendations number 4.
Thank you, Matthew. Good afternoon, everyone. Our third recommendation is for forestry sector. Our proposal is that government should further limit the harvest of old growth forests. Why is this important? Because old growth forest is like a carbon bank. Old growth forests in Canada store some of the highest rates of carbon in the world. So NRCan can work with provinces to reduce harvesting of old growth forests They can help by coordinating, developing documents of best practices, providing data, resources, and expertise. This will preserve the ecosystem of those areas. Clear-cutting and mismanagement of forests have several negative impacts, but some clear-cutting of these forests is still taking place. For their unreleased old growth strategic review in 2009, BC government hired 2 independent professional foresters to consult with all levels of stakeholders. They found that there is overwhelming agreement among the public to safeguard these old forests. However, preserving these old forests is not that simple. First, and the most basic problem is that there's no one definition for old growth forest. Provincial government has their own working definition, but they're often criticized for the way they characterize it. Their management strategies need revision. NRCan can help to define and update their old growth forest management strategies. Implementing this policy will not be easy. There might be opposition from the industry. It is because old growth timber gets them higher value than other kinds of timber. But damaging the ecosystem is a bigger problem. This policy can play an important role to further improve circularity in the sector. It contributes to high categories of circularity in our evolution tool, optimize and upgrade. It focuses on retaining the health of the forest ecosystem. Also, implementing this policy can create market motivation to maximize value from harvest. Industries are more likely to adopt sustainable harvesting practices if their future profitability depends on the productivity of the same piece of land. We recommend this policy as it has a lot of potentials. On to our 4th recommendation. This recommendation can be applied to more than one sector. It is to support renewable energy-based district heating systems. By support, we mean support through funding installation of new systems, funding to upgrade old systems, providing technical support, sharing knowledge and expertise from existing and old projects. District heating connects multiple buildings to the same system to heat homes and offices collectively. It is a sustainable substitute for fossil fuels. This system can help Canada to meet its heating demand efficiently while having less GHG emission. Now, how is it going to help the natural resource sector? We know there are unused residuals from the forestry sector. So why don't we use them? Well, in district heating, we can. Renewable district heating can use excess heat or residuals from natural resource sectors, and this is not a new experiment. It is a proven method for many countries, even in parts of Canada. For instance, Charlottetown in PEI and the community of Teslin in the Yukon are using biomass from sawdust for district heating. NRCan can share knowledge, learn from these systems and projects to help to implement it in other jurisdictions, such as Nova Scotia and the Northern Territories. However, working with different levels of government might create some administrative complexity, but it can also be used as an advantage. Through this policy, federal government will be supporting local authorities. This can help them to improve their relationship with local communities, especially with Indigenous communities. It decreases dependence on non-renewable heating resources. It can also spare room for other investments. For example, by having the Teslin district heating system, the Yukon government is planning to relocate budget on their economy and job creation. District heating is, however, not cheap. It requires high startup costs and it has uncertain payoffs. So industries are not willing to take on these projects without the support of government. Renewable district heating can be a significant step towards circular economy. It increases the efficiency of generating energy, which falls under our optimized category. The policy also contributes to resuscitate by using waste to create a more cyclical flow. The UN Environment Program describes renewable district heating as the most efficient solution to clean heating and cooling for many communities. For these reasons, we recommend this policy. On that, I will pass it on to Michelle, who will talk about our last recommendation.
Our last recommendation is about filling knowledge and communication gaps in industry and government. There are some great opportunities for innovation within the value chains in mining, forestry, and energy by creating new products, new branding opportunities, and more. But these changes require communication and collaboration between stakeholders who have not traditionally worked together. At the same time, it's difficult for policymakers to measure circularity or to identify needs and opportunities because some information is not collected or is not easily accessible. We have a two-pronged recommendation to address this. To begin with, NRCan can play a key role in breaking down silos of information within industries, between jurisdictions, and between government departments. Coordination of policies and cooperation with other jurisdictions are expressly part of NRCan's mandate. NRCan should also develop a proactive network or concierge-type service to help link circular economy stakeholders until those networks are better established within the market. A great starting point for this already exists. ICED's Clean Growth Hub is a project on which NRCan collaborates. NRCan should expand this type of hub to other areas of circularity. Data collection by NRCan can complement this effort in three ways. It can help identify obstacles and market failures. It can develop measurable indices for circularity. And it can help develop future policies that will improve circularity. NRCan can begin by compiling data from existing sources like Statistics Canada, other departments, provincial sources, and the National Pollutant Release Inventory. Statistics Canada may be able to help. Where knowledge gaps are identified, they can use their information gathering authority to seek new information. Non-commercially sensitive parts of this compiled database should be made accessible to industry and other stakeholders. Sharing information like this will increase the likelihood that market forces, rather than government intervention, bring about these movements towards circularity. To sum up, as part of a global economy, Canada needs to keep up and remain competitive, including by transitioning to a circular economic model. However, Canada plays an essential role as a supplier to the world of new energy and materials. And the concept of circular economy needs to account for this special context. Our 5 policy recommendations will help Canada address barriers to the circular economy currently faced by its natural resource sector. By addressing these barriers, Canada can demonstrate its commitment to a circular approach and can support future competitiveness of Canadian firms. We thank you all very much for your attention. We'd especially like to thank our sponsor, our academic coach, and everyone who has supported and contributed to this project. We'd welcome any questions or comments you might have.
Thank you, Michelle and team. So we are now going to begin the Q&A section. And you know, it's interesting, it's our last policy lab, and yet we have the highest attendance record of all previous 6 policy labs. So clearly there's a lot of interest. And I have to say, in the last couple of minutes, I've been very busy on the chat function, looking at all the different questions that many people have for you. So we have a long list of questions ready for you. We are going to start, and there's even questions going on in the chat function and comments. We are going to start with Jonathan Arnold. Jonathan was the coach for the team over the course of the last 6 months and a great support for the team through this process of defining circular economy. So Jonathan, if you could turn on your video, great, and your sound as well. And if you could start off our Q&A session with the first question, please.
Sure. Thanks for that great presentation. I'm a little biased, but thank you very much for that. My question is more on the policy problem that you had at the front of the presentation, and two parts to it. So if I'm an average Canadian living in a big city like Montreal, I buy lots of stuff. I'm not really connected at all with how that stuff is made. So why should that average Canadian care about circular economy on the upstream side of the consumption cycle or production consumption cycle? And then the flip side of that is if I'm an oil and gas company, or if I'm a mining company or a forestry company, you know, resources are fairly abundant in Canada. There's lots of space to put our waste from our production. So why should I, as this company on the upstream side of things, why should I care about circular economy in Canada?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Jonathan. And just to start it off, I guess that it brings us back to that distinction between the linear economy that Shirley talked about and then the circular economy. So the linear economy, talking about, you know, take, make, waste, the way that we've been doing things for the last little bit. And I guess the most important thing for the circular economy that we can boil it down to would be the 2 points of the environmental benefits and the economic benefits. So when it comes to environmental benefits, we talked about in our recommendations, restoring the health of ecosystems, you know, kind of looking at things again in ways that we haven't before, taking into account the different, or I guess the whole parts of the supply chain. So not just, you know, the consumer sees that product at the end of the day, but the consumer potentially being aware of everything that happens before it. So that's a big task. Although the scope of our project focused at the upstream side, so we were looking at resource extraction and processing, you know, that whole chain is connected, and people realizing that is one of the most important things there. So that was the environmental one. On the economic benefits, so the economic benefit that the circular economy could bring with it is potentially creating additional revenue streams for companies, but also I guess that's one of the main things for upstream resource extraction and producers. And by NRCan and other federal departments helping show that, it will help the whole chain there. So that's what I would kind of put it there too. So the part about economic and also the environmental aspect of it.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Matthew, for that answer. I would like to ask for two members with us from NRCan. So we have Daniel McDonald and Anthony Imbrugno, who have the next question. Daniel, why don't you start next?
Yeah, sure. Can everybody hear me? Excellent, seems to work. So on behalf of Natural Resources Canada, I first just wanted to start with a thank you. Certainly for the rigorous work that you've demonstrated and the high level of professionalism in that presentation. We appreciate that very much. Very topical, and I'd like to shout out as well the great participation certainly shows the relevance of this topic, and it's also relevant as we're looking at hosting the World Circular Economy Forum next year. So these circular principles align well with the innovation, sustainability, and transition to the low carbon economy that we're focused on in the natural resources sectors. I especially would like to thank you for delivering policy analysis that gets down to practical recommendations and is targeted specifically within the natural resources sectors with actions that can actually be implemented. And I congratulate you as well for narrowing the scope of a very broad project that we discussed when I came to see you in Montreal the first time. And it's good to see you again, and well done. I'm going to cheat here because if you remember when I came to Montreal, you asked me a question, and I'm now going to return that question back to you because my interest is in If you could elaborate, please, on international models of other resource-based, export-oriented economies, how they have incorporated circular principles into their economy and embedded them in their supply chains, and what lessons you drew from that to your policy recommendations for Canada. Thank you.
I can start off with this one. So thanks for your question, Daniel, and thanks for your presentation back in March, or even before that probably. So thank you so much for that. So your question is about international kind of lessons that can be learned. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Perfect, yeah. So I guess the way we started with it is we looked at a lot of other reports that were done on the circular economy. And I think one of my colleagues had said earlier in their presentation about resource scarcity being the driver. And then part of the goal that NRCan wanted us to look into was, separating, not just focusing on scarcity of resources, but also looking at, what's going to happen in Canada. So there are a lot of really good lessons that have been done, or that can be drawn from international work on circular economy. These models that have been developed by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. We also have in Canada, there's been some work by the Smart Prosperity Institute on making guides for policy, like toolkits for policymakers. So there's a lot of work going on there. And then I guess when it comes to resource, kind of like the upstream resource extraction, there isn't a lot there. And that's why we kind of really wanted to get into that. Maybe one example could be Finland. Finland, when it comes to their forestry sector, that's really what we looked at when we were looking at some international examples. So that would be the number one that comes, I guess the number one example that comes to mind for me. So.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Daniel. Let's move to Anthony for the next question.
Hi, good morning from Calgary. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was really interesting, and I really do like the hour circle thing that you put up there. I'll definitely be taking a closer look at that. But the question I have is related to this definition of old growth forest and the data used to come up with the recommendation. So just for a smidge of background, in Canada, when we look at the forests and the information that's put into the State of the Forest report, it comes down to unmanaged, managed, and then the sustainable allowable cut. And so unmanaged forests are bigger in this country than the managed forest. And no province, as far as I'm aware in the last report, hits the maximum sustainable allowable cut of the forest. And so when we look at circular bioeconomy, forestry, and conservation, we absolutely see them as very much in line and all part of the same, track to address the environmental ills of climate change, biodiversity loss, land use change. And when it looks like Canada will support the higher target for conservation, we very much see sustainable forest management as adding to that, as much as it also will work on being more circular and having the bioeconomy provide nature-based solutions and advanced bioproducts. The old growth issue is certainly one that gets a lot of coverage, let's say. And so I'm asking the question because it does come up a lot. And so I'd like to know more.
Yeah, maybe, so I guess that's a good one to start off. So your question's about, there's already existing things in place, but also I guess maybe Sumaiya, if you want to talk about a little bit about the past things for forestry and any example that we saw that worked really well. And also, yeah, do you want to run with that one, Sumaiya?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Anthony. I think forestry sector is relatively doing quite well in circular economy. And for old growth forests, they're already limiting it, but we're just recommending it to further limit it because old growth forest has a lot of advantages, and I know it gets a lot of attention from the media and everywhere, but we try to focus on areas that NRCan can work to improve the parts they have, they still need to work on. And honestly, forestry has done great work. For example, the district heating that we were talking about, they're already using sawdust for, which is a waste, and they're using it to create energy. And there are examples like that for forestry sector there that are great for circular economy. Yeah.
Thank you, Sumaiya. Thank you, Anthony, for that great question and insight into the old growth forest. Much appreciated. We're going to now move on to the Q&A from our faculty. We have questions from Christopher Reagan and from Ian Peach that are on the slot next. Chris, take it away.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, team. That was great. Great topic, great discussion. My question, I guess, not surprisingly, I was thinking about a carbon price as I was listening to part of this presentation, and I was thinking about why a carbon price works so easily, because you can clearly measure the thing that, more or less measure the thing, or know how many emissions are coming from any particular process. You can apply a carbon price, at least in many situations, and kind of the rest, the rest carries on from there. So it led me to wonder whether there is a simple metric for, let's say, a firm in any industry. Is there already, or could you develop a simple metric for the extent to which it is not in the circular economy? Like, could you look at something like the percentage of value added for a firm that is coming from outside of the circle, so to speak, and then put a tax on that? So, like, is that a crazy idea? Would that work? Has it already been tried? And does that connect to, is that basically what EPR is, an extended producer responsibility? So that's my question.
Thanks, Professor Reagan.
So I suggest you go with the question you heard, and then we'll just disregard any other part of the question we didn't hear.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Reagan. This question of a metric is one we looked at a lot and really interested us. And I think it goes back to it relates back to our fifth recommendation, which is to fill in knowledge gaps. Because the biggest obstacle that we encountered in trying to sort of make any quantitative assessment is simply that we don't have the uniformity of data and the availability of data across all areas of circularity that we have in Canada on carbon emissions. So we actually use, I think in our report, we actually talk about how, carbon emissions are well quantified, they're well known, we know what produces what. But circular economy encompasses so much more than carbon. It encompasses emissions of all kinds: air, ground, water, inputs, outputs, and we think it would be great to have some sort of metric and then consider whether or not there are ways to address it, like a tax or like other opportunities. But the obstacle right now is really a lack of sufficient data.
Excellent. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Chris, for your abbreviated question. We're going to move on to Ian Peach. We are following Ian around his cottage, I think. We get different views every hour.
Indeed.
So Ian, give us your question.
It's now too hot in Fredericton to be outside with the computer, so I've retreated indoors. Really interesting, thought-provoking presentation, so thank you. But I'm going to play constitutional and particularly federalism geek here for a minute. I think it's really important that you keep in mind and carefully unpack the question you put to yourselves at the beginning. What can NRCan do? Because I can imagine there's lots that regulators can do. You know, in forest competition for a forest management license, for instance, the regulator, the licensor, can make use of waste and limitation, therefore, of waste products a criterion for assessing who gets a license. I imagine a world in which you can tax waste such that circular reuse suddenly becomes more cost effective. But you have to ask, who is the regulator? And I think the description of the area of extraction and management of non-renewable and forestry as an area of shared jurisdiction is a bit overstated, particularly since 92A of the Constitution came into effect in 1982. So I want to ask you to reflect and respond to me in a reflective way. What specifically can NRCan, as an entity with, frankly, almost no regulatory authority in this area, almost no lawmaking authority in this area, do to stimulate this, and how does it do it in a manner that respects and fosters cooperation with those jurisdictions that actually do have the regulatory authority?
This is obviously one of the hurdles that we've addressed throughout we've tried to address throughout our report, because of course, NRCan doesn't have primary regulatory jurisdiction in many of the areas that we've looked at. Most of our recommendations are framed as, I think most of our recommendations reflect that role. Our recommendations are much more aimed at working with coordinating, developing best practices, some funding roles. But you're absolutely right that NRCan doesn't have that regulatory role in most of these circumstances to impose specific new rules, for example. The scope of our project was a little bit larger, and so we did look at other types of projects, other policy options that could be imposed even if they weren't imposed by NRCan. And so some of them can be done within federal jurisdiction. One of our policy options, for example, was looking at ECC's plastic ban and the impact that would have on circular economy. And that, of course, can be done under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act within the federal criminal jurisdiction. But you're absolutely right that we had to be very careful about the way that we framed our recommendations, because they're not things that NRCan can impose directly. And it really does entail a lot of cooperation and a lot of time sitting around the table and trying to get other partners on board.
Thank you, Ian, for that excellent question, and Michelle for that answer. We have one question from Sumaiya from Environment and Climate Change Canada. Sumaiya, if you can turn on your video and sound and ask your question.
Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, I'm having a bit of a connection issue, so I'm not going to turn on my video. I had a question with regards to your recommendation on the forestry sector, so following what Anthony was mentioning. I come from the sort of the waste division within ECCC, and I wanted to share like a few stats with you and sort of see your take on it. From the studies that we have conducted, it seems like around 1.2 million tons of wood is landfilled every year in Canada, and this comes from the construction and demolition sector. About 2.2 million tons of paper is landfilled every year, sort of coming from household and what we call institutional and industrial sector. I was wondering if, as part of your sort of the study you did on the forestry sector specifically, if you looked at some of the end-of-life policies to, for example, introduce landfill bans or more sort of comprehensive extended producer responsibility scheme as a way of trying to drive upstream practices when it comes to sort of harvesting and sort of forestry practices. by sort of introducing end-of-life policies to send that signal upstream, and then it would it sort of as a more flexible signal than sort of, for example, banning old growth forest harvesting, for example. And if you did look at it, sort of, what was your estimation of the sort of the impact of it? Sort of, did you see it as a I think you described it as a sort of a high value or high impact policy proposal. Thanks very much.
Okay, no, thanks for your question. So I guess what I would touch on there is you mentioned something about demolition and construction. We did see a good example of that for circularity. There's a company called Unbuilders. They also have one called Heritage Lumber. So kind of at the end of life there or not end of life, but they make use of these wood products by, instead of just landfilling stuff after demolition, they kind of selectively kind of deconstruct the house and then reuse those beams for other purposes until they reach their end of life. So that's one example we saw. About you talked about EPR as well, so extended producer responsibility. We did look more broadly at EPR in one of our policy recommendations that we ran through our matrix. It was more general than forestry. It was just kind of seeing how you could do EPR at different levels. It wasn't one of our 5 recommendations, but it is something that does come up as another potential policy option that's very helpful. Because I guess I would bring that back to the main point that the circular economy, or Canada's transition to a circular economy, is not going to happen with just our 5 recommendations. It also includes several other policy options, including, extended producer responsibility as one of them.
Thank you, Sumaiya. Thank you, Matthew, for that answer. We have a few questions on the chat. John Stewart also wanted to make a comment and I believe ask a question. Some of the comments were regarding your recommendation for district heating. So Carolina Seward from ECCC asked if district heating could also be geothermal. And John, if you could turn on your video and your sound and ask your question.
Sure. Can you hear me, Natalie?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Well, thanks for this great presentation, and it's great to see the student faces again. I guess maybe I'll expand my comment to the following, and this might be grounds for a next level of analysis here. But there's going to be a scale challenge, right, in making an economy truly circular. Current waste streams, or the accessible part of current waste streams, may be much smaller than overall demand, or there may be great changes in the waste stream. For example, we've seen a collapse in waste paper supply, recently. District heating in Canada and building heat generally is a vast demand. And the further north you go, the harder it gets, because you have long parts of the year when there's not a whole lot of sunlight, days are short, all the water is frozen, so hydro capacity gets affected by freezing. And that's an energy storage problem. So you have this huge energy demand, and the further north you go, places like Iqaluit, Nunavut, which I've visited a couple of times, they need to supply district building heat, and they're not going to be able to do it with renewables. And on very cold days, the wind doesn't blow, as well as having a very short number of hours of sunlight. You have very little wind when it's extremely cold, which is when you need the most building heat. So renewables are a great place to start. That technology is available now, but the further north you go, the harder it's going to be. And the more places you try to supply, the harder it's going to get. So I guess this is just a comment. Don't constrain yourself too much in what sorts of clean energy you might access, or what renewable means. I know we want circularity, but renewable can mean a lot of things. Geothermal is an excellent example. And so would be micronuclear reactors that are reusing the waste from old nuclear reactors, because that's going to be an option after 2030. So maybe scope for a future analysis.